What if the country that claims to love democracy more than anyone else is the same country that quietly destroyed it? Not with tanks rolling across a border, not with a formal declaration of war, just a briefcase full of cash, a handful of thugs, and a plan drafted in a quiet office on the other side of the world. In August of 1953, something happened in the streets of Tehran that looked, on the surface, like a popular uprising. Like the people of Iran had risen up and taken their country back. But it wasn't that at all. It was a performance, and the script had been written in Washington and London months before the curtain went up. A man was dragged out of his home that day. A man the people of Iran loved like a father. His name was Mohammad Mosaddegh, the elected Prime Minister of Iran. And the story of how he fell is one of the most important stories you've probably never been told. To understand what happened in August of '53, you have to go back further, all the way back to the desert. In 1901, the Iranian government, then ruled by the Qajar dynasty, handed a British businessman named William Darcy something extraordinary. A 60-year concession to explore for oil across nearly all of Iranian territory. The price? Embarrassingly low. Darcy searched for 7 years and found nothing. He was about to give up entirely. Then, in 1908, deep in the province of Khuzestan, oil erupted from the ground for the first time. That smell rising up from the earth that day wasn't the smell of Iranian wealth. It was the beginning of a very long lesson. The Anglo-Persian Oil Company was born the following year. By 1935, it had been renamed the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company, or AIOC. The refinery they built in the southern city of Abadan became the largest in the world. Tankers left its docks every single day, full of crude oil heading to Europe. One side got very rich. The other side stayed poor. In 1947, AIOC reported net profits of £40 million. Iran's cut? $7 million. That's about 17.5%. The Iranian workers living near the refinery earned 50 cents a day, had no sick leave, no vacation pay, and lived in a shantytown they called Paper City. No running water, no electricity. Meanwhile, British AIOC employees lived in company housing with gardens, swimming pools, and a golf club. This wasn't a secret. Everyone in Iran knew it, and for decades it just sat there, simmering. The man who finally said enough was Mohammad Mosaddegh. Born in 1882 into one of Tehran's most prominent families, his father had been the country's finance minister. Mosaddegh went to Europe for his education and came back with a doctorate in law from the University of Lausanne in Switzerland and an unshakable belief in the rule of law and the sovereignty of the people. He wasn't what you'd picture as a revolutionary. He was a thin, elderly man with a bald head and a slight frame, known for giving press conferences from his bed in his pajamas, a habit born of chronic illness that followed him his whole life. But behind that frail appearance was one of the sharpest political minds in Iranian history. The man who would eventually be called Time magazine's Person of the Year in 1951. On March 15th of that year, the Iranian parliament, the Majlis, voted to nationalize the oil industry. The AIOC's monopoly was over. On April 28th, Mosaddegh was elected Prime Minister with 79 votes to 12. The National Iranian Oil Company was born, and for one brief electric moment, it seemed like Iran was finally about to own its own future. People danced in the streets. In cities across the country, strangers embraced. After decades of watching their country's most valuable resource flow out of the ground and into foreign hands, Iranians felt something they hadn't felt in a long time. In the quiet offices of London and Washington, no one was dancing. For Britain, Mossadegh's decision was an act of war. The AIOC wasn't just a profitable company. It was Britain's single largest overseas asset, the lifeblood of its post-war economy and its navy. Losing it overnight felt like a punch to the gut. London fought back with an economic blockade. No country was to buy Iranian oil. The Royal Navy intercepted tankers in the sea. International oil companies were pressured to stay away. Iran's oil production collapsed from 242 million barrels in 1950 down to just 10.6 million in 1952. A country that had been generating hundreds of millions of dollars in oil revenue was suddenly struggling to make payroll. But Mossadegh didn't break. He took the case to the International Court of Justice in The Hague and won. The court ruled it had no jurisdiction. He flew to New York to address the United Nations and was treated like a hero, his face on the cover of Time, his arguments drawing applause from the world stage. The harder Britain pushed, the more popular he became. That's when London started shopping for a different kind of solution, and when a man named Kermit Roosevelt Jr. began quietly studying a map of Tehran. History is usually told by whoever wins, that the black box doesn't lie. There are things that happened in Iran in 1953 that were buried for more than 60 years, until the government in Washington was finally willing to admit, in their own words, that what they did was carried out under CIA direction as an act of US foreign policy, conceived and approved at the highest levels of government. That admission came 60 years too late to undo any of it, because in the time it took for that admission to arrive, Iran changed in ways no one had predicted. The hatred planted in Tehran on one court, August night, grew slowly and quietly for decades, through the iron fist of a king propped up by foreign money, through the silence of a people who learned to whisper instead of speak. Until finally, in 1979, it erupted in a way that reshuffled the entire map of the modern world. This is the story of a set of decisions made in closed rooms, decisions that are still echoing today. It's a story about oil and money, about fear and power, about one man who believed the right thing was enough, and about a system that proved him wrong. Picture this. You're a powerful American politician. It's 1952. You're sitting in a well-air-conditioned office in Washington, and you are genuinely scared. The Korean War just ended, but the fear didn't go with it. To the east, the Soviet Iron Curtain stretches across half of Europe. Country after country has disappeared into the darkness and come back out flying a red flag. In that atmosphere, a British man walks into your conference room, sets a folder on the table and says two words: communist and oil. That's really all it takes. By 1951 and 52, Britain was in a tough spot. The economic blockade was working in one sense. Iran's oil revenues had cratered and the economy was hurting. But Mossadegh wasn't bending. He'd won at The Hague, he'd won at the UN, he was more popular than ever. And Britain's first instinct, asking Washington to help muscle Iran back into line, had been shot down by President Harry Truman. Truman wasn't interested in helping a colonial power claw back its oil monopoly. He thought Mossadegh was a nationalist, not a communist. He thought Iran deserved its oil. But then January of 1953 came around, and a new president moved into the White House. Dwight D. Eisenhower was the supreme Allied commander in World War II. He was used to making big calls on big maps, and in his world, everything, absolutely everything, got filtered through the lens of the Cold War. Britain knew they had to change their pitch, so they did. They stopped asking for help getting their oil company back. Instead, they started warning about the Soviet threat. The argument was clean and simple and terrifying, which made it perfect. Iran shared a long border directly with the Soviet Union. If Iran's economy collapsed, Mossadegh might have no choice but to turn to Moscow for help. The Tudeh Party, Iran's Communist Party, was real and growing, and an Iran that fell into Soviet hands would put all of Middle Eastern oil within reach of the Kremlin. Say the word communist in Washington in 1953, and every door opens. Eisenhower nodded. The man chosen to run the operation on the ground was Kermit Roosevelt Jr., senior CIA officer and the grandson of former President Theodore Roosevelt. He didn't look like a spy. He had a high forehead, dark-rimmed glasses, and the easy manners of a college professor. One colleague described him as the last person you'd expect to be up to his neck in dirty tricks. He was soft-spoken, well-connected, and completely lethal in the quiet way that the most effective intelligence officers always are. On July 19, 1953, he slipped into Tehran, hidden in the back seat of a car, lying flat and covered with a blanket, as guards waved the vehicle through checkpoints. He moved into a safe house with no name on any map, and from there, he began pulling the threads of the CIA's network in Tehran, one by one. In April of that same year, CIA Director Alan Dulles had already signed off on $1 million for the CIA's Tehran station with a simple instruction: use it in any way that brings down Mossadegh. $1 million in 1953 bought a lot in Tehran. Politicians, clerics, journalists, military commanders, and street muscle. CIA and MI6 officers had met in Cyprus and Beirut to hammer out the details. In a mid-range hotel somewhere on the Mediterranean, a small group of men sketched out a plan that would determine the fate of tens of millions of people. The money started moving before the plan was fully ready. Newspapers in Tehran began running stories attacking Mossadegh from every direction. Some called him a communist, some blamed him for the economic crisis, some painted the country as sliding toward chaos. Every single one of those articles was written by someone on the CIA's payroll. Certain members of parliament started changing their votes after sealed envelopes arrived through back channels. Religious leaders who had once supported Mossadegh began delivering sermons against him after receiving requests accompanied by valuable gifts. And in the gyms and back alleys of Tehran, a different kind of recruitment was happening. Men known as the Luti, street athletes, weightlifters, tough guys for hire, started getting phone calls. They weren't being recruited for ideology. They were being paid cash to show up and make noise. But all of that was scene setting. The play couldn't start without a signature from the man in the palace. The Shah, Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, was 33 years old, and he was, in the bluntest possible terms, afraid. He was nothing like the iron-fisted autocrat the world would later come to know. In 1953, he was a young man who had grown up in his father's shadow, unsure of himself, aware that Mossadegh was beloved by the people in a way he himself had never been and probably never would be. Kermit Roosevelt arranged multiple secret meetings with the Shah. A car would come at midnight. Roosevelt would lie down flat in the back seat under a blanket, and guards would wave the car through the palace gates. In that darkness, the spy sat next to the king and explained what was going to happen and what the Shah would receive at the end. The Shah asked for more time, said he needed to think it over. Roosevelt drove away more than once, feeling like he was trying to walk a horse across a bridge it refused to step onto. In early August, General Norman Schwarzkopf Sr., who had existing ties to the Shah, arrived in Tehran, sent by the CIA with one mission: close the deal. Roosevelt met the Shah again on August 1, 1953. Same midnight pickup, same blanket in the back seat, same darkened palace room. But this time, the conversation was different. The Shah finally agreed. On August 15th, he signed two royal decrees, one dismissing Mossadegh as prime minister, the other appointing General Fazlollah Zahedi, the CIA's hand-picked choice, as his replacement. That same night, Radio Tehran broadcast a coded signal, a short sentence that meant nothing to most listeners, but everything to the men waiting in safe houses across the city. Operation Ajax was live. Then it immediately fell apart. When officers showed up at Mossadegh's residence to deliver the decree, he refused to acknowledge it, turned them away at the door. His own security forces pushed back, shots were fired, and news of the failed attempt spread through the city fast. The Shah panicked. He fled the country that same night, first to Baghdad, then to Rome. The first coup had failed. But Kermit Roosevelt didn't move. He stayed in Tehran, because he still had the money and he still had the plan. And what he was going to do next would make the first attempt look like a rehearsal. Here's something true about power that most people would rather not think about. If you want to destroy a leader that the people love, you can't use an army. That just makes him a martyr. You can't use the law. He hasn't broken any. What you have to do is turn his own people against him. Make the chaos look like it comes from him. Make everyone believe the country is about to collapse and that he's the one holding the match. That was the science Kermit Roosevelt was applying in Tehran. And over 3 days in August of 1953, he put on one of the most audacious performances in the history of covert operations. After the first coup attempt collapsed on August 15th, and after the Shah had fled to Rome, the situation looked, on the surface, like it was over. Mossadegh's supporters were out in the streets celebrating. Statues and portraits of the Shah were being torn down across the city. Roosevelt stayed put. He messaged Washington that the operation could still be salvaged. Washington told him to proceed. What happened on August 19th was not a popular uprising. It was theatre, meticulously designed, paid for, and directed by a CIA officer in a safe house. That morning, Tehran woke up to what looked like spontaneous street protests breaking out across the city. Hundreds of people poured into the streets, some waving the Iranian flag, some carrying portraits of the Shah, who had fled to Rome days earlier. It looked organic, it looked real. But if you watched closely, something was off. Some of the men in the crowds had the builds of weightlifters, thick necks, rough hands, bodies like they'd been living in a gym. They didn't have the look of people who had woken up that morning burning with political conviction. They had the look of men who were on the clock. The CIA had hired the Luti, Tehran's well-known street athletes, strongmen and hired muscle, to pour into the streets and do 3 things: demonstrate in support of the Shah, smash up offices belonging to political parties they were told to target, and burn newspaper stands that ran pro-Mossadegh coverage. The sound of shop windows shattering echoed down the streets. Tea house customers ran for cover. Charred pages from burned newspapers floated up into the morning air like black confetti. People leaned out of windows, watching, not knowing who was who or what was real. And that was exactly the point. Not to fight, but to make everyone feel like there was no solid ground left beneath their feet. Simultaneously, a separate group, also on the CIA payroll, marched through other parts of the city shouting pro-Mosaddegh slogans, then attacked buildings and storefronts. The goal was to make it look like Mossadegh's own supporters were running amok and burning the city down. By mid-morning, Tehran looked like it was in the middle of a civil war. While the streets burned, the real operation moved quietly behind the smoke. General Fazlollah Zahedi, the CIA's chosen replacement for Mossadegh, a man who had collaborated with the Nazis during World War II, but that apparently wasn't disqualifying, came out of hiding. Military commanders who had been quietly contacted and flipped in the weeks prior began moving troops. Tanks rolled out of barracks and into the streets of central Tehran. The sound of tank treads grinding against stone echoed through the city. Soldiers took positions at key intersections. Within hours, they had surrounded Mossadegh's residence. Mossadegh knew it was over. The 71-year-old prime minister slipped out of his house before the soldiers broke through, climbing over a back wall into a neighbor's yard while gunfire rang out nearby. But the following day, he came in and turned himself in. There are photographs from that day. In them, Mossadegh is wearing pajamas, the same pajamas he was famous for wearing when he received foreign diplomats in his bedroom. His face is completely still. No tears, no panic, just the quiet dignity of a man who already knows how his story ends and has decided the way he carries himself at the end is the only thing left that belongs entirely to him. The man who had stood at the UN podium and been treated like a statesman, who had been on the cover of Time, was loaded into a military vehicle with his hands bound. Some of the people watching from the sidewalk cried. Others turned away. What happened in Tehran on August 19, 1953, is known in Iran as the 28th of Mordad, the Day of Betrayal. The death toll from the violence that day sits somewhere between 200 and 300 people. Alan Dulles flew in from Washington to accompany the Shah back from Rome. The Shah stepped off the plane in Tehran smiling wider than he probably ever had. He had more power now than he'd ever held in his life. And he knew exactly who had given it to him. General Zahedi was installed as Prime Minister. The CIA wired $5 million to his government within days of the coup. Iran's democracy, which had been growing, fragile and imperfect but real, was frozen solid in a single afternoon. Mossadegh was put on trial before a military tribunal. The charge was treason. Standing in a room full of uniformed officers, he gave a speech instead of a defense. "My only crime," he said, "if it can be called a crime, is that I nationalized the Iranian oil industry and ended the system of political and economic exploitation by the world's greatest imperial power." On December 21, 1953, he was sentenced to 3 years in solitary confinement. After that, house arrest in the village of Ahmadabad, 120 kilometers from Tehran, for the rest of his life. He died on March 5, 1967. He was 84 years old. Per his own request, he was buried in the living room of his house. He didn't want the government building an official tomb that could easily be demolished or ignored. He was right to worry. To this day, no one is allowed to visit his grave. Operation Ajax was a clean, tactical victory for the CIA. A few months of work, $1 million in the budget, not a single American soldier deployed. The result? A friendly government, an obedient king, and the oil flowing back into Western hands. The CIA was proud enough of this success to take the exact same model and apply it the following year in Guatemala, where they overthrew another elected leader, this time to protect the interests of an American banana company. But what wasn't in any of the success reports was the real cost. Not the cost in dollars, the cost that gets measured in decades of pain, building quietly underground. In the sound of a door knocked on in the middle of the night, in the slow, patient fury of a country that never forgot what had been done to it. The Shah who returned that day was not the hesitant young man who had fled to Rome. He came back knowing exactly where his power came from, and knowing that to keep it, he would need to make sure no one was ever in a position to take it from him again. The seed planted on August 19, 1953, didn't sprout overnight. It grew slowly, and in 26 years, the world would find out exactly what it had become. Ask yourself this: if you got your power back not because you fought for it, but because someone else did the fighting for you, how would that feel? Maybe relief, maybe gratitude, but probably something else underneath both of those things, something you wouldn't say out loud. Fear. The fear that what happened once could happen again, and that next time there might not be anyone coming to help you. That fear was living in the chest of Shah Mohammad Reza Pahlavi when he stepped off the plane in Tehran in August of 1953, and it shaped every single decision he made for the next 26 years. The Shah who came back was a completely different man from the one who had fled. He had learned two things from this crisis. First, people are dangerous. Give them freedom of assembly and free expression, and they can topple anything that gets in their way. Second, his power didn't come from his bloodline. It came from Washington's support, and Washington would keep supporting him for as long as he was useful to American interests. Those two lessons pointed in the same direction. The Shah would rebuild Iran, but he'd build it in a way that left no room for anyone to question him again. In 1954, a new oil agreement was signed, and it wasn't what Iranians had fought for. Under the deal, a consortium of Western oil companies replaced the old AIOC. Iran would receive 50% of oil profits, which looked, on paper, like a major improvement from before, but the actual operations, management decisions and production control stayed entirely in the hands of the Western consortium. American companies alone held a 40% stake between them. Iranians had traded one master for a group of them. The name nationalization remained on the paperwork. The reality in the oil fields barely changed. The thing Mosaddegh had sacrificed his political life to fight for was handed back to foreign interests in an afternoon by a man who hadn't done any of the fighting. What the outside world couldn't see was what was being built behind the palace walls. In 1958, with direct CIA assistance, the Shah established a new security organization, an organization that Iranians would remember for generations as a symbol of pure dread. It was called Savak. Savak, the National Intelligence and Security Organization, was trained by CIA and Israeli Mossad advisors. Its official purpose was protecting the country from external threats. Its real purpose was one thing: eliminate every voice that dared question the Shah. Students who talked about democracy in university classrooms disappeared the following night, leaving behind nothing but a pair of shoes at the door. Writers who criticized the government were summoned to an office and didn't come out for months. Some came back and never spoke again of what happened inside. Opposition politicians who dared to speak publicly found their families suddenly in danger. Tehran, under Savak, was a city where people chose their words carefully, even among close friends, because no one knew who might be reporting to Savak. The silence that blanketed the city wasn't peace, it was fear wearing a white shirt. Meanwhile, the Western world looked at Iran and liked what it saw. The Shah spent the country's oil revenues, which were substantial and growing, on modernization. New roads, hospitals, universities. Iranian students were sent to study in Europe and America. Tehran filled up with high-rise buildings, shopping malls, international restaurants, and luxury hotels. Foreign visitors in the 1960s and 70s described Tehran as vibrant and sophisticated, not unlike any modern European capital. The Shah was treated like royalty in Western capitals. The White House hosted him on official visits. Magazines and newspapers ran his photo in full military dress. Articles praised him as the architect of modernization in the Middle East. But underneath that polished surface, cracks were running in every direction. The first problem was pace. The changes were moving faster than Iranian society could absorb them. The Shah's White Revolution, launched in the early 1960s, promised land reform, women's voting rights, and rural literacy programs. On paper, progressive and admirable. In reality, the land reform process left hundreds of thousands of farmers landless, pushing them into cities where they became cheap factory labor. The best land quietly ended up in the hands of the Pahlavi family and their allies at court. The second problem was inequality, and it was everywhere. When oil revenues surged in the 1970s, wealth piled up in enormous quantities among Tehran's elite. Palace parties that went on for days, galas with guests flown in from across the globe, diamonds and gold on the wrists of women at official functions. Meanwhile, the rural migrants who had flooded into the city lived in slums on the outskirts with no clean water. Young men from villages, no land, no skills that fit the city economy, sat watching a life they had no part in through the plate glass windows of shopping malls. The look in their eyes changed, slowly, from hope to something harder. That anger wasn't just about money, it was about feeling looked down on, left behind, and turned into spectators of a wealth that was supposedly their country's. The third problem ran deeper than any policy or economic statistic. A huge number of Iranians never forgot what happened in 1953. They knew the Shah, standing at that palace entrance, had come back because of American money and CIA planning, not because the people had chosen him. In religious gatherings, in poems passed hand to hand, in careful conversations in private homes, Mossadegh's name was still spoken with quiet respect. But that respect couldn't be shown in public, because Savak was always listening. Forced silence doesn't kill anger, it just pushes it deeper. By the late 1970s, when President Jimmy Carter started pressuring the Shah to ease up on human rights, it was like lifting the lid off a pot that had been sealed shut for decades. Everything that had been building underground came up to the surface all at once. And it didn't look like a demand for Western-style democracy the way anyone in Washington expected. It came up in the name of God and justice and dignity, led by a man who had spent 15 years in exile, patiently waiting for exactly this moment. On January 16, 1979, the Shah boarded a plane and told the public he was going on vacation. He never came back. He died of cancer in Cairo, Egypt, on July 27, 1980. Far from the country he had ruled with an iron fist for over 20 years. Operation Ajax was a success story in 1953, but the real outcome wasn't written in that year. It was written in every night Savak knocked on a door, in every poem composed in secret, in every whispered conversation in a darkened room. Until finally, it reached a point where no one could go back. The CIA's clean tactical win in August of '53 became a strategic catastrophe 2 decades later. History doesn't always punish bad decisions quickly. Sometimes it waits. It lets the decision mature, and then it collects, all at once, with interest. The seeds planted in Tehran in 1953 grew into something with roots too deep to pull out, something that is still growing today. In 1979, the world had other things on its mind. The Cold War was still grinding along. Western economies were still recovering from the oil crisis of the mid-70s. Washington was busy with its own problems. Nobody was watching Tehran with any real attention, even though the warning signs had been there since early that year. But in the narrow alleyways of Tehran's old neighborhoods, in mosques packed with people, in small apartments where students passed cassette tapes to each other with trembling hands, something was building, bigger and more powerful than anyone had calculated for. To understand what happened in 1979, you have to understand what ordinary Iranians had been carrying for the past 25 years. Under the Shah, they had watched their country transform at extraordinary speed. Skyscrapers rising from the desert, cars filling highways that didn't exist a generation ago, women in Western clothes in shopping malls, foreign visitors in luxury hotels and airport lounges. The surface of Iran looked like a modern country being pulled into the future. But underneath that surface, something never went away. The feeling that their country was being governed by someone they hadn't chosen, that the king on the throne had gotten there because of foreign money and foreign planning, not because the people had put him there. And the bitterest feeling of all, the one no one could say out loud because Savak was always listening, that in 1953, the democracy they had briefly held was stolen from them by hands that had never once touched Iranian soil. That feeling had been sitting quietly for more than 25 years. Think about what it takes to live with anger you're not allowed to express, to raise your kids, to watch what they say even inside their own home. 25 years of enforced silence doesn't create acceptance, it creates pressure. The kind that builds and builds under a sealed lid. And a sealed lid, given enough time, always gives way. By late 1978, Tehran was starting to shake. Protests started small. Student groups took to the streets. Workers went on strike. Clerics gave speeches in mosques. The Shah sent Savak to handle it. And every time Savak cracked down, more people came out. Cassette tapes of sermons by Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini, a cleric who had been in exile in Iraq and later France, were being smuggled into Iran and passed around like an underground current. The deep, steady voice on those tapes told listeners that the Shah was a servant of America. that Iran's oil had been stolen, that the time had come for the people to rise. The message had nothing to do with communism, nothing to do with Western-style democracy. It was about justice, equality, and the dignity of a Muslim people who had been ground down for too long. For Iranians who were hungry, spiritually and materially, that was the message they had been waiting to hear for years. And sometimes, what is whispered in the dark is more powerful than anything broadcast in the light. On January 16, 1979, the Shah boarded a plane with his luggage and told the country he was going on a rest. Everyone around him knew he wasn't coming back. The plane lifted off over a Tehran still clouded with protest smoke. People on rooftops watched it disappear and felt something shift. Not quite joy, not quite grief, just the unmistakable sense that the world they had known was about to be completely different. 2 weeks later, Ayatollah Khomeini returned from 14 years of exile to an airport in Tehran where millions of people were waiting. The image of that elderly man in black stepping off the plane is one of the most powerful photographs of the entire 20th century. The Islamic Revolution was complete. But the moment that permanently shattered the relationship between Iran and America came on November 4th, 1979. That day, a group of Iranian students stormed the American embassy in Tehran and took 52 American staff members hostage. The world was baffled. Why? Why would students do something this extreme? The answer was 1953. Those students weren't attacking the embassy out of some general rage. They were attacking it because they knew exactly what that building was. It was the place where the coup had been planned. Kermit Roosevelt had walked in and out of that compound. CIA money had flowed out of it. And in 1979, those students were genuinely afraid that history was about to repeat itself. That America was going to use that embassy to bring the Shah back to power, just like it had done before. They took the hostages because they were afraid of another Operation Ajax. The 52 Americans were held for 444 days. During that time, the relationship between the United States and Iran collapsed completely and permanently. The hostage crisis also directly contributed to President Carter's defeat in the election, reshaping American politics for years to come. All of it traced back to one August night in 1953. It wasn't until the year 2000 that Secretary of State Madeleine Albright acknowledged that the United States had played a significant role in the coup, as close to an apology as any American official had ever come. Then in 2009, President Barack Obama said in his Cairo speech that the US had played a role in the overthrow of a democratically elected Iranian government. And on August 19, 2013, the 60th anniversary of the coup, the CIA declassified documents confirming that the operation had been carried out under CIA direction as an act of US foreign policy, conceived and approved at the highest levels of government. That was the first time the CIA itself had officially said so. 60 years after the fact, Iran is still waiting for a formal apology. Because acknowledging something and apologizing for it are two completely different things. But the legacy of Operation Ajax didn't stop at Iran's borders. The success of the operation convinced the CIA that regime change was something it could do cheaply and effectively, almost like a product that could be replicated. The same model was applied in Guatemala in 1954 to overthrow President Jacobo Arbenz, who had moved to reform land ownership in a way that threatened an American fruit company's interests. The list of countries where democracy was undermined by unseen hands from Washington stretches across the second half of the 20th century. Each time the model was used, it left marks, scars in societies that sometimes took decades to surface. And when they did surface, they rarely looked the way anyone in Washington had planned for. What's hardest to sit with in this story isn't who was right or wrong. It's the scale of consequence that flowed from a decision made by a small group of people in a closed room. The men who signed off on Operation Ajax in 1953 were not thinking about 1979. They weren't thinking about 52 hostages. They weren't thinking about an Islamic Revolution that would redraw the map of the modern Middle East. They were thinking about oil and tomorrow. But history doesn't end at tomorrow. It keeps going, deeper, wider, and longer than any one person can see from a well-air-conditioned conference room. That is the lesson Operation Ajax left the world, a lesson the world is still in the process of paying for. Some questions don't have clean answers. What if the first coup attempt on August 15th hadn't failed? What if Mossadegh had held on for one more year, long enough for American policy to shift under a new administration? What if, on that night in August, a single military officer had refused to move his tank because some small part of him knew what he was doing was wrong? Would the Middle East look different today? Would Iran have developed into something different? Would the Islamic Revolution have happened at all? No one knows. And that's one of the heaviest things about studying history. The roads not taken are invisible. All you can see is the road that was. Go back to the beginning, before everything fell apart, before the tanks rolled, and before the old man in pajamas was put in a military truck. There was a moment in Iranian history when democracy was actually working. Imperfectly, every democracy is imperfect, but it was moving forward. People elected their representatives. Those representatives passed the laws the people wanted. A trusted leader was trying to bring his country's most valuable resource back under national control. That's not radical. That's just a country trying to govern itself. And then it was gone. In a single night. Not because the Iranian people were tired of it, not because the government had failed, but because a small group of people sitting in rooms on the other side of the world decided that Iran's democracy was inconvenient for their plans. The most painful part of Mossadegh's story isn't that he lost, it's how he lost. He didn't lose because of bad policy decisions. He didn't lose because he was a poor leader. He didn't lose because his own people turned against him. He lost because a system that was bigger and colder and more calculating than anything he could have imagined decided to destroy him with money, propaganda, hired thugs, and bought soldiers. Without firing a single bullet from foreign soil, Mossadegh was fighting something he couldn't fully see because it had no face, no flag, and no declaration of war. He was like a boxer who walked into the ring believing the fight had rules, only to discover that his opponent wasn't in the ring. He was standing in a corner you couldn't see, moving all the other fighters by remote control. Standing before the military tribunal before sentencing, Mossadegh gave a statement rather than a defense. "My only crime," he said, "if it can even be called that, is that I nationalized the Iranian oil industry and dismantled the system of political and economic exploitation by the world's greatest empire." That was it. That was his crime. And that's exactly why he had to go. If you ask what still connects that story in the past to the present, it's not the oil, it's not the geopolitics, it's memory. Every generation of Iranians that grew up after 1953 grew up with the story. Sometimes it came as a grandparent's whisper. Sometimes it was a poem memorized in a locked room. Sometimes it was an old black and white photograph of a man in pajamas kept in a drawer. The kind of thing you don't put on display, but can't bring yourself to throw away. The story didn't teach people to hate America directly. It taught something deeper. It taught people to be careful, to question anyone who shows up offering help, to remember that the person standing behind the curtain with a smile might be holding something you can't see. That kind of watchfulness, once it settles into a culture, becomes part of its DNA. It lives in the way a mother explains the world to her child, in the slight hesitation before someone accepts a foreign offer, in the tone of voice when an older person mentions America. It's buried deeper than any document declassification can reach, and that is the real legacy of the night of August 19th. Not the change of government, the change in how people see the world. There's one more lesson Operation Ajax left behind, and this one belongs to all of us, wherever we live. The stories we get through the media, through governments, through official channels, those stories aren't always the complete picture. In 1953, the American press reported the coup in Iran as a popular uprising, as the people taking their country back, as a failing government swept aside by the will of the nation. Major publications ran stories saying Iranians had been liberated, that the Shah was the leader the people wanted, that Mosaddegh was a failed, unstable politician destroyed by his own excesses. The actual truth was locked in classified files, waiting for enough time to pass, waiting for the people who were there to mostly be dead, before the documents were declassified and the real story came out. And the uncomfortable question is this: if it happened in Iran in 1953, how many other times has it happened? In how many other places? And how long do we have to wait before those files get opened too? Mohammad Mosaddegh died on March 5, 1967, in the bedroom of his house in the small village of Ahmadabad, 120 kilometers from Tehran. He was given no state funeral, no monument was built, no street in Iran was named after him. To this day, no one is allowed to visit the grave in his living room. The state he gave his life to serve chose to forget him, both under the Shah and after the revolution, because his memory was too powerful for any government that held power to be comfortable with. But in Cairo, Egypt, a street was renamed in his honor in 2004. A small gesture from a country that wanted to pay its respects to a man rejected by his own government. That's the strange way history sometimes works. The people who lose the political battle can end up winning something the victors never anticipated, a place in the longer memory of the world. So here's the question we came in with, and we still haven't fully answered it. If a country that claims to love democracy is willing to destroy it when that democracy becomes inconvenient, what does the word democracy actually mean? Does it mean a system where everyone gets a vote? Or does it mean a system where you get to vote as long as the outcome is acceptable to whoever holds real power? This isn't an attack on any one country. It's a question that every society, every single one, is always in the middle of answering. Do we actually elect our leaders? Does our vote weigh the same as the vote of someone with more money and more power? And when the leader we elect does something that threatens the interests of the truly powerful, what happens next? The story of Operation Ajax isn't just Iran's story. It's a story about the system human beings built and about the questions we haven't finished answering yet.
Mosaddegh in his pajamas is a symbol of something much bigger than himself. He stands for everyone who ever believed that being right would be enough, that if what you were doing was genuinely just, the world would give it space to breathe, and who discovered, the hard way, that the world sometimes doesn't work that way at all. But his story is also a symbol of something else, that the truth tends to find its way out eventually, no matter how many decades it takes. 60 years is a long time to wait, but in the end, the documents were unsealed, the names were recorded, and the world found out what had really happened. History doesn't tell us who was right and who was wrong. It just shows us that every side always believed they were right. And that, more than anything else in this story, is the most frightening thing of all. The black box is sealed. Until next time, take care.